Well, I think one more week and we'll have the attendance in here down to 0. So, and then I'll leave and go do something else. Beautiful thing about getting to do what I do. Instead of having to do 40 sermons a year, if I were Randy Roper, I do the same sermon 40 times a year at different churches. And I know it's a satisfying sermon because I hear a lot of people saying, I've had just about enough of that kind of preaching. So I know it's a satisfying sermon. And Madison, thank you for making it. I mean, I was here 2 weeks ago and 1 week ago. Thank you for making it. Madison had me on the softball field as her escort on Faculty Appreciation Day, and I just did it again. Jaden, the catcher. And so now I've got a softball signed by Madison. I've got a nice card signed by Jaden. And women's softball is a wonderful thing at Oklahoma Christian. It puts in a lot of good students that I wouldn't have met otherwise. So we are. What's that?
I think the minors agree.
Yes, I think so. I'm kind of looking at where in the world did we leave off last week. We talked about in talking about various stones, we talked about the stones of in and around Jesus's time on the mountain, the stone that Jesus didn't turn into bread. And as I remember, and we're going to go a couple places tonight. We're going to go to John, the 8th chapter, I believe, where we talk about the stones that people picked up to throw at the woman caught in adultery. We're going to go to the Old Testament, and we're going to talk about the 12 stones picked up out of the middle of the river to be made into an altar. And so we'll do at least those 2 tonight and more if we have the time. So I appreciate you being here. And we've got this week and 1 more week to do. I'm just having to play things entirely loose because of my mother's situation, but I sure hope I can be with you again next week. I told the elders of the church that I was doing this for free until I paid my taxes this week, and what I'm going to do now is just go get a contribution plate and pass it. So it was a relatively brutal week. Let's turn to John, the 8th chapter. Now, if we were doing a textual criticism class, this is actually a piece of the text of the Bible for which we have later fragments and not early fragments. And so you may have something in your Bible that has a little note to you that says something like oldest manuscripts don't have this, etc. Mine reads the earliest manuscripts do not include, but we are talking about something that at least by the 2nd century AD had been found. So we are talking very old and probably inspired scripture. And I say this about this story, even if it were added later by a scribe, isn't it a wonderful story? And doesn't it sound just like Jesus? So, Brent, can I call on you to read the first 11 verses? John 8.
I'm going to start with 7:15.
Okay, please do. That's where you're supposed to, in fact.
Okay. Then they all went home, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who had heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin."
Thank you. Thank you. Depending on your count, this is one of 3 or one of 4 of what are called the entrapment stories. The entrapment stories are when the Pharisees, the scribes, the chief priests would come to Jesus with an impossible question. And whichever way he answered, he was trapped in the entrapment stories. Okay. Now, this is an entrapment story in the fact that why shouldn't we stone her? The law says so. Why not? Okay. What questions do you have about this episode if this is all you heard about it? I mean, I can come up with at least two. Yeah.
Where's the guy?
Yeah, exactly. Where's the guy? Yep. And
where's the witnesses?
where are the witnesses? Okay. Did they actually catch her? If so, did they even give her the chance to reclothe herself? Or is she there in all of her shame? And another question I want to know is, what is Jesus writing? Is that a form of like counting to 10 before you slap your kid? I mean, we don't, but often. But is that a form of that? Did it mean something? Some really interesting questions. Name another entrapment story. There's a couple of famous ones.
Seven brothers married the same.
Seven wives.
Yeah. Who's gonna have it?
Exactly. Got a woman. And what are they trying to get at with all that? These people didn't believe in the, exactly, didn't believe in the resurrection. So they created an entrapment story where this woman would literally have 7 husbands in heaven, given the laws, the Levirate laws and others. Another one that's kind of famous is the coin. Pay your taxes. Very timely right now. You know, here's this coin. It's got Caesar's face on it. And then that is when Jesus did the render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God. So this is not an uncommon occurrence because there's others like it. Now, if you've been here before, if you've read the book, you know that what I do is I introduce a rock and then I just tell some stories. Okay, so we're going to tell some stories tonight. I got this one from a newspaper editor in the Miami area where he claimed it happened. It sounds like a cutesy story, but it almost sounds like a cutesy preacher story. But I know newspapers well enough to know they've never heard a preacher speak. So it's probably not a preacher story, but it's a story about a Catholic Cuban girl who is devoutly Catholic and comes to the States, and she wants to keep all of the sacraments. And she finds a bilingual priest, and once a week she confesses to this priest. Okay, the story is told as true. And one day the priest informs her he'll be gone next week. She decides that she's still going to keep the sacrament of confession. And so she gets with a friend and phonetically writes out sins. Like if you were to try to just write out 1 through 10 in German, you would eins, ins, etc., all the way to Zane, 10. Okay. So you could speak 1 through 10 in German simply by reading it. All right. So she has listed her sins. She has memorized, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. Okay. So she speaks very, very little English other than this. She goes to a priest who only speaks English. She gets in the booth. And that's when she discovers, again, the booth is dark. And she said, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. She looks down, she can't read her phonetics. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. No better. And then finally, if the story is true, she says, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned, and I can't see my sins. You know, I just think that's wonderful. I can't often see my sins. Isn't it wonderful that we don't have to live in a society like the lepers did in Jesus' time, where they had to yell out, unclean, unclean? What if we had to yell out our chronic sins, our recent sins? You know, angry, angry, judgmental, judgmental, unkind. And we keep them in. And then we can't see them. We can't see them after that. I think the moral of John, the 8th chapter, this woman walking away forgiven is when you're forgiven, you leave the rocks behind. These are stones that didn't get thrown, and they're stones that don't need to be carried along. Okay? Another story that comes to mind when I think about this whole concept of forgiveness is I think about being at the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta and seeing the old photographs. You may have seen them too, of the police and the marchers, of the snarling dogs, the water cannons, the smoke, the baton sticks. And every time you see any form of police brutality on an otherwise peaceful march, and Martin Luther King asked marchers to be peaceful, you also see the bystanders. And in those photographs are the ones that interest me. People sneering and making it hard for little grade schoolers to walk to school in Little Rock. Tiny kids looking up at a lynched individual. Onlookers watching police train fire hoses on people. Sometimes dispassionate, sometimes even sneering. And to me, that it's sort of like the modern day mocker at the foot of the cross, because there were some. He can't save himself. He claimed to save others. He can't save himself. And it occurs to me when we come to this matter of forgiveness that we have a choice of joining the mockers at the foot of the cross on a Friday evening or joining the crowd of worshipers on a Sunday morning. Forgiveness is a wonderful thing. Do you remember what Peter did? Oh, I'm getting out of the frame. I promised I wouldn't get out of the frame. So stuck here, what did Peter do on the night that Jesus was being tried? It's a famous story. Denied Jesus 3 times, so much so that he even uttered an oath, used bywords, tough language, so that surely you can't confuse me with a follower. I'll even curse about it. And then the rooster crows, right? And we're told that he is instantly ashamed. But that's the fall of Peter. But that's not what interests me in the context of the stones not thrown, the forgiven woman. What interests me is that when the ladies rushed on Sunday morning to find Jesus, they found this man. Weren't for sure he was Jesus. Different accounts, 4 different accounts. And to one of them, Jesus says the following: go tell the disciples, and he added, go tell Peter. Specifically, go tell Peter. Peter, who in our last episode was crying bitterly because he denied Christ. Tell Peter it's okay. And in fact, I'm going to build my church on the declaration of Peter that I am who I said I was. We are valuable in people. That the woman caught in adultery, Jesus saw her value. Anybody in here ever collected coins? Anybody? Stamps, coins? What makes one more valuable than another? Yeah, rarity, not circulated, rarity. You want to see a 100-year-old letter? I've got one. This is a letter from July of 1917, where my 2 maiden aunts who never married are wondering if their brother, who would be my grandfather, was going to return home from World War I. Of course, they didn't call it World War I. That'd be kind of absurd. It was the Great War. You don't number them till you have 2. But I didn't even bring it for that reason. But it's old. It's rare. there was a coin that was struck, and there were only 5 of them in 1902 when the world was moving from Buffalo head nickels to Liberty head nickels. And the mint was moving from somewhere else to Philadelphia, and the year was changing all at once. So you had a different place, you had a different year, you had a different head. And somewhere in all of this turnover, 5 coins were struck that the information was wrong. Immediately, rare. The government tried to keep them out of circulation, but eventually these 5 coins would end up in the hands of kings, emperors, criminals, and even one NFL owner. And we pretty much know where all 5 of them still are today. Now, the last time one was on the market, it sold for about $5 million. And the question comes, is it worth $5 million? Well, because someone paid that for it, it must be. What's your soul worth? Well, because of what Jesus paid for it, it must be valuable. But let's walk up to a vending machine with that nickel. What's it worth? 5 cents. And so we've got the possibility that things that we see as rare and valuable, the world sees as 5 cents. And things that we see as 5 cents are really rare and valuable. Like that woman who was caught in adultery. We don't even know her name. I don't think I'm going to do this next story. It's a little hard to tell, and I sometimes don't get all the way through. It's about a May 3rd tornado. But I'm going to go on to another one. It's a really good story. You might buy the book and maybe you can read it. But the
Dr. Patterson?
Yep.
On that story, since you're going to move on to another one, I just want to share something that I think Oklahomans ought to know, and that is called the Soiled Dove Plea in Woodward, Oklahoma, by Sam Houston's son, Phillip Houston.
Right.
And it is a very similar situation. They have a prostitute in Woodward, somewhere around 1901 or so, maybe 1890s. And she comes to him as a lawyer and says, I need help. They're trying to run me out of town. Not getting the equal case. And so soiled dove means essentially dirty dove, and he creates a little bit more of a modern version of this story, cites a verse, and then says, hey, if all of you are innocent and you ignored all the opportunities to help her before we ever got to this point, go ahead, convict her. Sits down, they all don't convict her, but it's still
powerful.
It's still taught in law schools today as a premier closing argument.
Interesting.
Good old Woodward, Oklahoma.
So I do have one May tornado story to tell. This is about a woman named Kathleen and her teenage son, Levi. Oops. When they realize they're in Moore, where the tornado crossed 2 times in 4 or 5 years, where that Golden Dome Bank is, and the really nice Warren movie theater was built there in the rubble. When they realized they weren't going to be able to make it home, they saw these overpasses that you see on I-35. And this true story. And they get out and make a run for it to get under an overpass. Okay. And they're going to try to cling to the concrete, the girders, the metal, anything they can. And of course, the heavy roof of the overpass should take care of them. It's almost like a vacuum cleaner under there. It is trying desperately to suck them out. And this tornado, the May 3rd one, was so big that it had an eye like a hurricane would. And here is Levi. Many other people are up under here. And Kathleen is literally hanging out. Levi is just under, and there's others that are under. And during the eye, when she realizes that the back wall of this tornado is going to be even fiercer than what we've experienced, Kathleen felt like she was going to kill Levi, that they were going to fly off together. And so she simply said, I love you, Levi, and let go of his hand. And I've always known that story. You can make your own application out of it. But when we're talking about, sacrifice and value and stuff like that, what greater sacrifice than that? And so I knew that story because I was working at the Oklahoma, and every one of us covered every story. And then about 2 days later, and no one else has ever put these together, but the Daily Oklahoman had a front page story about two guys that went joyriding during the tornado and got away with it mainly because they packed up under an underpass. And I thought, oh my. And I actually told my editor at the Oklahoman, if you'll look back 2 days ago at Kathleen and Levi's story that did make the paper, you might want this one in. There was even a color photograph of them standing on that overpass, rejoicing that that's where they rode out the storm. And of course, they crowded someone else to her death. So all sorts of, I just love the fact that good stories come to me. And that's why the other book's called Greatest Stories of the Bible, is just there's so many good stories. And Madison knows that I love stories. That's what I want to hear when my students write, is tell me a story. And so one time I got a magazine article. I was a contributing editor for sports back when, man, we're going to get to one rock tonight. I was a contributing editor for sports back when there used to be a TV guide just for the satellite industry. Way before it was on your phone, way before it was on your screen. You could get this big, thick magazine once a month that told you what 200 channels we're going to have on for the month. And to have content, they hired several of us as reporters. So I had the ultimate press pass. I've been in to see the Lakers, the Celtics. I've been everywhere on this press pass to get content for the Dish magazine. In fact, it was called Dish magazine. And I did a story once in April, right before the Masters was on, about the most important shot in golf. I love golf. I have fun. I'm not good at it, but I do love it. And you would think, all right, think of the most important shot in golf. It'd be a shot that would come up on nearly every hole. It would be a shot that would be obviously important. So you might think long putts, long drives, good sand wedge. And so I started ranking them. And the most mundane one came up. The shot that links the closest with money winners on the PGA Tour, champions on the PGA Tour, is a simple shot called hitting the green in regulation. Any golfers here? GIR, greens in regulation? Yeah. It's getting there in 2 on a par 4 so that I have a couple of putts for par. Getting there in 3 on a par 5 so I have a couple of putts for par. Hitting the green on a par 3 so I have a couple of shots for par. It's the most important shot in golf in that it correlates most with the shots that win. Is it glamorous? No. 350-yard drive is glamorous. 60-foot putt is glamorous. Holing out with a sand wedge is glamorous. But here's this simple, mundane activity done over and over and over again that correlates with the best players in the world. And then I take it a little further and say, do we really recognize rarity when we see it, like that nickel? Do we really recognize it? What if you turned on the television tonight and they announced the lottery winners for this week? 5 balls, 1 through 40. And the numbers that won were 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. What would you think? Well, if you think like my friend here, you would say it's just as statistically likely as any other combination. Isn't it, Brad? Just as likely. Would you play it, assuming you're a gambling man? Would you go home and say, honey, I bought the winning tickets. They're 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. No. But it would be just as likely. And so why is it that that would be so rare that it can't happen? That would be so rare that it can't happen. So why is it when 12, 17, 24, 35, and 37 are picked that we don't go, my, that's rare? You know how rare those 5 numbers were? As rare as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As rare. But they look ordinary. They look mundane. And we're going to get probably into the stones of the altar when the river was parted and the children of Israel walked through on dry land. We're probably going to get to them next week. But one of the things that we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk more about miracles, is we're going to talk about the fact that these stones were needed to remind the Israelites of the miracle. In fact, the text is going to read that. And also the text is going to be that passage I promised you a couple of weeks ago, and the rocks are there to this day. Okay, that's the rocks, and we'll be going that way either in a few minutes or next week. Now, were miracles rare for the Israelites? It says that they were going to have this heap of rocks put on and I can guarantee you, I live in the mountains for 3 months a year. I climb to 10,000 feet every day. There are no piles of rock in the wilderness or on the mountain that are accidental. Too much energy required, too thin of oxygen. If you're down by the river, too hot and muggy, that it just accidentally is a pile of rocks. And so there's this pile of rocks that children are going to ask, why are they there? The text says that the child is going to be curious. Oops. Okay. Now, what miracles did the Israelites see daily that they had simply forgotten were miracles? Food. Yes.
Their clothing and stuff also didn't wear out, which
Their
I'm
clo-
sure you noticed at some point.
Exactly. I was reading today. I know it sounds ridiculous that I prepared for this, but I was. But I was reading today and someone said, how about fresh water in the desert? That was probably miraculous. We know that Moses struck a rock. Manna. Clothing never wearing out. Good one. A pillar of fire. Enormous military victories with unbelievable body counts. 5,000 slain, 10,000 slain. Of course, the miracles about the Ark of the Covenant. You touch it, you die. And different things about that. The sun stood still at one point in a battle. And here's my point. They had been around so many, quote, everyday miracles that they were kind of getting used to everyday miracles. But, you know, if you read, especially God's conversation with the prophet Isaiah, he would say that a miracle is a waterfall. A miracle is dew. A miracle is something that we've just gotten, like the children of Israel that didn't think a thing about manna dropping out of heaven, but needed to be reminded of the waters parting. We've gotten so used to everyday miracles that they look like 15, 17, 21, 30, and 35 lottery numbers rather than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I was watching in our little community in the summer of Angel Fire, New Mexico. The city puts up these inflatable movie screens and has a walk-in drive-in movie. Okay, up against the mountains, probably about 50 degrees. Everybody's in warm jackets watching a movie. You ever been to one of those clubs or anybody, church? Okay, so you know the idea. A lot of manufacturers now make the right equipment. Projector projects the right equipment. And you just have a good time having an outdoor movie without being in your car. And so we went to one, and for about 3 days before this outdoor movie, the nation had been in a meteor shower. Okay, that if you looked up, you'd see a little pencil streak here and maybe one here. You'd almost think they were floaters in your eye, but they happened often enough. And then if you read the paper, okay, we're in the middle of a meteor shower. So here we are watching a $50 million Hollywood movie full of stunts and action and unbelievable this and how did they do it that. And all of a sudden, a meteor comes that lasts a full 3 seconds. Very orange. And everybody quits paying attention to the movie and starts whispering, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" And then break out into applause. And I make the point in the book that Hollywood can spend $50 million making a movie, and God can nudge a rock out of its orbit, and he gets the applause. So, everyday miracles. The heavens declare the glory of God, stated in Revelation. George Gallup, as the pollster, literally invented the science of polling. And I teach polling. I think you may teach polling. You may have learned it, probably didn't, but if you learned it, you learned it from him and not me. And the science of saying that this little group can stand for the whole group, okay? They have to be randomly selected and many other things. The questions need to be neutral. But sure enough, you can get a pretty accurate picture of what America thinks without 2,000 people, okay? Now, the report card on a pollster is an election, okay? So if you call an election for George W. Bush needs to win, or you're not considered a very good pollster. So they do have occasional report cards, and they're called censuses. And so if we predict that Oklahoma has grown by 7%, and then the 2020 census says it did, then that's a good poll. All right, so they have report cards. So he decided that his last poll, the most respected pollster in America, George Gallup, would be on faith. He had been doing polls on faith forever, and he was going to do a final poll on faith, and he was going to personally write the report. He was going to personally close the book on his career with this poll on faith. And in this particular poll on faith, around the turn of the century, so it's been a couple of decades now, he found that 86% of all people in America claimed to believe in God. But he found that only 50% worship. 86% claim to follow God, 50% do. And one of the ways that we insidiously try to get people to not lie is we ask, "Do you attend church?" "Oh, yeah, I attend church." "Okay, 70% attend church." "Yeah. Did you go to church last Sunday?" And all of a sudden, it comes tumbling down. It is the last Sunday question that gets the real response. So here were 86% of all people were believers, and half had gone to church in the most recent Sunday. But that's not the thing that got Gallup's attention. The thing that got Gallup's attention is that he found that 1/2 of the religious, of the people who believed in God, of the people who go to church regularly, really go to church regularly, could not define the word grace. Could not define the word grace. And since Ephesians tells us by grace you're saved through faith, it kind of behooves us to know the definition of grace. And did you see the movie Saving Private Ryan, about the guy who all of his brothers died and a special group had to go find him so that his mother didn't have 4 dead sons, only had 3. And he stayed and fought a battle with his comrades before he went home and obeyed the will of the President of the United States to get him home. And then very, very late in the movie, he's over in France, that Cherbourg area, and he is in a massive graveyard. And they've taken the young actor, still the same actor, Matt Damon, and they've aged him. Almost as you see him, he ages, and he's looking down at people who actually died so that he could go home. And then he looks up at his wife and his children, and he says, "Tell me if I've been a good man. I need to know if I've been a good man." If we need to know the answer to whether or not we've been a good man, all we have to do is see what Jesus paid. All we have to do is see that the same Savior that prevented this woman from getting rocked to death is the same Savior that wants us to be saved as well. And these rocks testify to that. So when Peter tried to put a limit on forgiveness, how many times do I have to forgive this idiot over here? 7? What did Jesus reply? Yeah, a bunch. How about 7 times 70? Some versions 7 times 77. And many people will say that's simply infinity in the Greek world. All of the times you're asked if you will forgive, you must forgive. Why? He told a whole parable about that. You will be forgiven as you forgive. So the guys that threw the woman out, and Jesus squats in the circle, and Jesus writes something in the dirt. Jesus says what he says. They go away. He looks up at her and says, "Where are your accusers?" If you look at the story one more time, and this is a story that it almost depends on how late the version is and which fragment of scripture they used, but it will say something to the effect that they left from, I believe it was the youngest to the oldest, or the oldest. Yeah, there we go. I'm trying to figure out logically. Why would the oldest go first? He knew better. He was ashamed. Probably had more that needed to be forgiven, by the way. You know, there's a saying that you'd be a fool to, what is it? A fool to not be conservative when you're young and liberal when you're young and conservative when you die. I think I've been a fool my whole life, but the gospel is liberating. And you know what I mean. We're not talking democratic politics. The gospel is liberating. It's freeing. And here was the oldest saying, you know what? I'm showing no mercy, no grace. Now imagine the 50% of all Christians who can't tell you the role that grace played in the woman caught in adultery. That's tough. And I think that sometimes we just need a back to the Bible 4-week session and get things like grace, mercy, faith out on the table and discuss them. If you look at Micah, when he's starting to ask, what does God want? I mean, you ever thought about shopping for God? Let's look at that. Micah, the 6th chapter. We'll probably end with this. And I'll be the luckiest man in the world if I actually got that right. You want to help me here, Josh? Go to the 6th. It's actually written in the atrium of our school, this little verse. Again, I brought this brand new Bible that all the pages are sticking together here. Here we go. Okay, what does the Lord require? 6:6. And Josh, have you got it? Are you scrolling the Bible thing? Okay.
6 verse 6.
6:6 and go to 6:8. 6:6 through 6:8.
With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000 of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God.
What's good? Mercy, justice, kindness. Those are actually the rocks on which we can build our modern day altar. We got about 6 or 7 minutes left. Let's look backwards and finish off this concept of the boundary stone. Let's go back to Genesis, the 31st chapter. And because it's a 10-verse story, I will just recap it. In fact, I'll find it here easier than I'll find it in that sticky Bible. So Jacob took up a stone and set it as a pillar. He said to his relatives, gather some stones. So they took stones and piled them in a heap, and they ate by that heap. And Jacob called it Gilead, the word Gilead, this heap is a witness between you and me today. And that boundary was so that Jacob and Laban would war no more. And boy, they had gone at it. He fooled him about his daughters, so he worked 7 extra years. He fooled him about the speckled sheep so that he didn't get the flocks that he deserved. There was, as we'd say today, there was history there. And so in some ways, this rock story, which is the least significant of all the rock stories in this book, is one of the most significant in that two people who could have made life miserable for one another, could have warred on forever, decided to call it peace. And that brings me, no, I better not. If I try to open up that 100-year-old letter, it's going to fragment. So I better not. I better just talk to you about it. But when you look at the whole area of life's boundaries, couldn't it be said that life is better inside the boundaries than outside? You know, in fact, in one of the oldest versions of King James, when Paul is trying to run to Damascus and he's persecuting Christians, the angel asked Paul, how long are you going to kick against me? How long are you going to try to go the other way? And we talked about Jonah going the other way. You ever had a kid that had to test every boundary? Life's better inside the boundaries. I walk 4 or 5 miles every day, and I was telling Josh some walking stories today. Yesterday, in my walk, somebody zoomed past me. I'm on the sidewalk there in the street. It's down around Teal Ridge, and immediately they jumped the curb and bust both tires on the right-hand side. Probably texting and driving. That would be my guess. I didn't stop sympathetically. I just kept walking, going, you dummy, you deserve it. But wouldn't that person say my life would be easier if I had stayed inside the boundaries? And in fact, that is a law. In fact, we have a whole Olympic sport of bobsledding and skeleton where, trust me, gravity will get you to the bottom. The slickness of the ice and the steepness of the mountain guarantee you, you're going to get to the bottom. The whole event is, can you stay inside the boundaries? Can you not run up the walls? Can you not flip over? And so we will probably take this up again, but I love this verse that says, this heap is a witness. And later in the passage, it's going to say, even though no one is with us, God is a witness. God knows the promises we've made. God knows the boundaries we've set. So, in our last couple of minutes, I'm looking. So this complicated relationship with Jacob and Laban is going to come to a head this night with forgiveness, with peace, etc. And it reminds me of a New Testament story, and we'll end here. Do you remember the story of why Paul and Barnabas went like this? What caused it, Brent? John Mark. Who did Paul ask for in Rome when he was in prison because he wanted someone to, quote, comfort him, end quote? John Mark. There is a way home when we've gotten out of bounds. And I think one of the saddest things is when someone A, doesn't recognize they're out of bounds, or B, thinks they're so far out of bounds that God doesn't want them back. And the Apostle Paul's story of saying, I don't think John Mark is reliable. Barnabas, you take him. I'll go this way. In the first place, it created 2 mission teams. God can make things good out of something not good. And in the second place, it taught John Mark at a relatively young age redemption. Paul wanted him back. So next week we're gonna kind of go back to this. We're also going to talk about one more time. We're going to talk about the altar after the rivers have been divided, and then maybe the most famous stone in the Bible, David and Goliath. David, well, yes, the stone rolled in front of Jesus's tomb. Very, very good. We'll do. In fact, those are so important that that's probably what we'll do next time is David and Goliath and the stone in front of the tomb. You've been great. Thank you. I can't guarantee you I'll be with you next Wednesday, but I sure will try. Okay. I appreciate it. Let's say a prayer to end. Father, it's been good to be here. It's been good to have all these people, have them looking, reading your word, looking lively, enjoying our time together. Thank you that we have fellowship to follow. Thank you for the love in this room. Thank you for the multiple generations in this room that are at far different stages of their life, but yet find a common denominator in you. Thank you for what people in this room have meant to this church, what people in this room have meant to Oklahoma Christian University. And Father, I've been blessed to get to know some more of them. We ask all of this in your son's name. Amen.